This week, we will be talking about making money, monetization. It's kind of like the final step. Doesn't always have to happen at the end of your kind of content journey, but it is kind of the final step that people want to get to where they actually make money from all of their work that they put into putting content online. So quick recap. This will be the last kind of like lecture style session where up until now you've heard a lot of me talking. We'll have a session next week. It'll probably be more so just to connect people, close out any loose ends, things like that. I won't have slides prepared in the same way, but this week we're talking about this final section of the book, which is monetization. We're going to talk specifically about 6 different types of monetization. Really, there's kind of audience plays, there's brand plays. The idea is you're either selling your audience's attention to someone else, or you're getting your audience to pay for things yourself. There's also this SWOT framework that kind of helps you think through which one might make the most sense for you. This is kind of like the distribution section where there's not necessarily a correct way to do it, but just a different way to think about where you might start and how that evolves over time. So a quick couple of slides just on some of the things that we actually talked about in previous sessions. So the first one is just remember the contract that you started or you created, hopefully in one of the earlier chapters. This idea where I use Lululemon as an example. There's certain things, certain expectations that people have with you as they engage with you or your brand. And you have to make sure that you're actually abiding by those things because that's what forms the relationship. And so the reason I'm bringing this up at this juncture is because this is the easiest place for you to basically forget some of those things that you established in your contract, whether they were explicit or not. So this is the perfect juncture where you get, some affiliate offer or deal and you're like, wow, I can make a lot of money with this. And in the back of your head, you're thinking, this isn't really right for my audience. This is when you go, okay, well, actually, I shouldn't engage in this because everything that you do with content should be a long-term game, abiding by that contract. So if you remember, I said in lecture 2, you want your kind of evolution of content to look more like this versus this, which means you're slowly building up trust and by nature building up your audience over time versus any quick changes where things balloon because you're probably in the case of something ballooning like this, not really following your contract and then quickly disappearing. I think it's common for people to say things like, oh, I have this many subscribers on my list, for example. You don't really own anything. What you have is a bunch of micro relationships, and those relationships have built up anywhere from, a couple days to a couple years. And the thing about a relationship is that it can, take a long time to build up, but you can lose it in an instant. So for example, if you do start selling something to your audience that, they trust you for being super high quality and super high integrity, and then you sell them something that they spend $500 on and it's complete shit, well, you lost their trust. And it's really hard to win trust back once you lose it. So you can build up a relationship over a long period of time, but it only takes an instant to ruin it. So remember to keep your contract in mind. Also, something that is important is I completely understand that some people, especially as they're going and creating their own businesses, need to make money right away. If that's not the case, then you may consider just not worrying about it and focusing on building an audience, at least at the beginning, because slow and steady isn't necessary, but it can win the race. So this is straight from the book, where this was my MRR up until August. It's grown since then because of the book launch, but you can see that this is exactly how much I made from different channels over a year, right? So I started my publication in early 2019, and this is not just my content, but also any projects that I had launched. And in most cases, I wasn't charging. So you can see for around a year, I was making basically nothing. And you can see even throughout the year, I was getting, small little bits from things like my Patreon, a couple dollars a month from Medium publication, things like some affiliates like Udemy, Ghost, etc. So I'll talk about a little more of some of this later, but the idea here is that if you are in a space where you don't have to monetize right away, you can really gain some momentum by not over monetizing at the beginning and then finding a way to monetize in the future. And this kind of relates to this slide, which is just the idea that what brings you from A to B might not get you to C. So at the beginning, certain channels for monetization tend to make more sense. They aren't as scalable or big necessarily, but things like donations, you can get a decent amount, or at least like a nice seed at the beginning. And then in the future, they almost certainly will not get you to the point where you can get, a full-time salary from your content. But then other things like creating products for your now hopefully sizable audience will potentially get you there. All right, so this is an image that I saw recently, which relates to this idea that was in the book, which is basically that there's many ways for you to get to a pretty healthy level of monetization with your content. You can start, everyone's kind of inventing an economy these days. So you can start really with a professional economy. If you have a full-time job, that's effectively like having one client, one person who purchases something from you at a very high dollar amount, right? But you can start moving upward or downward, however you want to view it, where basically you're increasing the number of people that you're servicing, but decreasing the amount that you need to get from them. And in this case, we're talking about $100,000 a year, but you can also think about it similarly with, if your goal is to get 5K a month, that could be with just one single $5,000 consulting gig, but it can also be with 10 courses. It can be with 50 subscriptions at $10 a month. It could be way smaller than that. So you could have like many, tens of thousands of page views. So you can try to kind of work backwards where you set your goal, right? Maybe your goal is only $50 a month. Maybe it's 5,000, maybe it's 50,000, whatever it is. You can start to work backwards and figure out what you would need if you're going to pursue some of these channels. And also consider that you may be limited with your audience. So for example, in the book, I talk about the newsletter for Iraqi oil executives. Well, there's not that many Iraqi oil executives out there. So in that case, you really wouldn't be able to make money through simply like using affiliates or donations likely, but you can get there if you charge for your content or you have a product. So that's another way to kind of vet out, how much you want to make and how you can get there. I can just start answering questions throughout. So I see Chris is asking, how do you feel about upselling after they sign up for your newsletter? He's saying, I have a gardening newsletter, and on the thank you page, I have an offer for a book that is specific to this interest. I think that's a great option. I don't think it's sleazy at all. People are used to that, especially if it's relevant to the people that are signing up. It does look worse if it's not relevant. So if someone signed up to, let's say, just a general newsletter about tech and they get upsold like a gardening product, for example, then they would, be confused and likely not convert. But I would also say that there's nothing wrong with putting an upsell right after your newsletter sign up, but it's unlikely that many people are going to convert at that exact juncture because they don't know you that well. They haven't established that much trust with you. And so you can put it there, and I don't think it does much harm, but I would also go in with the understanding that it probably won't convert much. What likely will convert better is if you create almost like targeted content around that particular thing that you send to your list. And then as they go through that content, it's almost like a filter for people who would be interested in that particular thing. Or you can continue nurturing your newsletter with kind of like plugs of your back-end product or the upsell so that they see it consistently. Because, there's that like term or that fact in advertising where it's like, someone needs to see something 7 times before they convert. I don't think that's always true, but the idea is that it's really unlikely that if someone's first engaging with you and they've never heard of your product, especially if it's a relatively expensive product, that they're going to convert at that juncture. But you want to hit them multiple times. So you can put it there, but again, just have the understanding that they probably won't convert on that first interaction with you. All right. So with that said, on this slide, I basically, the takeaway is that there's many ways to get to whatever your financial goal is. And this slide is basically to add on top of that to say there's many tools that you can use. And this is very similar to chapter 2 when we talk about the different tools that there are to actually start a newsletter or a blog or servers, stuff like that, where basically in this case, the same thing rings true, where for the most part, there are so many tools out there right now that you don't need to find the perfect one. For example, if you want to do donations, there are like a handful of tools that I'll show in a second that'll allow you to do that. And for the most part, they all work. So you don't need to kind of really harp on which one is perfect or try to optimize it. And basically the idea here is that with anything you want to do, whether it's create a course, whether it's gate your content, whether it's create videos, the tooling exists out there. And this is, you know, again, something related to chapter 1, we're in a place where it's so easy, easier than ever to actually put this stuff online. And so it really is pretty easy if you have an idea of what you want to create to actually go create that thing and monetize it. All right, so these are the 6 different kind of buckets of monetization that I'll be talking about in this session. I'll have 1 or 2 slides for each. It's basically paid content, donations, affiliates, web ads, newsletter ads, and then products/services. The main takeaway of this kind of framework that you see here is that certain ones are much easier to set up, certain ones are much harder to set up in general, although not always, but in general, the easier it is to set up, the easier it is for everyone else to set up. So the more competition there is, and likely the less that you get in per person or per page view or per reader, for example. And therefore it requires a larger audience. So this is true for things like donations and affiliates and web ads. The harder something is to set up, like products or services, the more you likely can charge for those things, which means that you don't necessarily need to require such a big audience in order to make a lot of money, as we saw in one of the prior slides. So this is just a vague way of thinking about it. And again, what you start out with, so for a while, all I was making money from were things like donations and affiliates. Didn't get me super far, but got me a little bit of money as I was building my audience. And then later, this book was a product, and that eventually, you know, allowed me to monetize my audience a lot more effectively in the future. So there's this kind of SWOT framework, and I joked about this in the last session that it doesn't actually spell sweat because expected timeline comes after audience. But the idea is that you want to just think about how scalable a channel is, a monetization channel, right? How much work it takes, because that matters. The audience that you require to actually have this become a pretty profitable, sizable channel. And then of course the expected timeline as well. And that really, this final part really depends on you, right? So if you're not in a rush, as I wasn't, then you don't have to worry about this expected timeline as much because you can build things up over time. All right, so let's talk about each of these individually. So you have paid content. We talked about this one a lot in chapter 2 because it really is a precursor to deciding like how you're going to run your publication. So I'm not going to go into this in too much depth, but as we talked about in week 2, there's a bunch of companies doing it now. And this one fits a little bit in the middle in terms of difficulty, right? Because it's a lot harder to do than like slapping a pixel on your site, but it's a lot easier to do than, you know, creating a completely new course, for example. So it fits somewhere in the middle. And for that reason, the kind of return that you can get on this is also somewhere in the middle, where you don't need a huge audience to, you know, get a decent amount from paid content. But it probably won't bring you hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. There are very few people that have managed to do that. And the pros and cons we talked about before were basically the main pro is that you can validate quickly and you can kind of tie the value that you're providing very closely to what you're monetizing, so that if you're not providing value to people, they just unsubscribe and they no longer pay you. The con is that you really lose the distribution vector. It can hinder your growth because your value is put behind a paywall. And so the TLDR here, I won't go into this one too much because we went into it before. It's just that if you want to do paid content, there's nothing wrong with that, but just remember that because of the more aligned incentives, you need to provide significant value and it can restrict growth. So there's no right or wrong here again, but this is one way you can monetize. Now, if we talk about easier ways to monetize, especially if you aren't gating your content, one of those ways is donation. So as you can see here, as I mentioned, there are so many tools that allow you to do this, and I've seen people using all of these. Donations are a great way to make a little bit of money at first and also to kind of keep that reader relationship going. But it's super hard to scale. I have not really seen anyone, at least in the content space. You might see this in like the gaming space, for example, with Twitch streamers, but within the content space, I really haven't seen anyone who's been able to scale up donations to a super sizable amount. But it's kind of a no-brainer because you don't necessarily need to invest very much to just get a couple donations coming through. So for example, in my newsletter or at the end of my articles, so I always put it in a place where it's like, someone will only see this if they got value through reading through the content. I just simply say, if you like the work, if you found value from this, like you can buy me chai, for example. Calvin does something similar where he basically says the same at the end of his newsletter where they can, you know, support him on Patreon. The idea here is it's super easy. But again, if you want to be a creator that makes 10K a month, this probably won't get you there unless you have a huge audience. One quick thing I will mention is that if you do Patreon or something similar, you should make your membership levels intertwine with the value that you provide. And what I mean by this is not just having membership levels that are, $2, $5, $20 that are basically the same and don't really provide anyone with any value. Although that's kind of what my Patreon does, but that's why it really doesn't bring in much. But Cassidy has a great example of one that people know her for, she's a developer. People really respect her for that. They love her projects that she puts online. And each of these levels starts to bring in some of those aspects where people can start to get resume reviews with her. They can get, free coupons for the courses or projects that she's working on. They get invited to chats with her and other people, things like that, where it's like very closely intertwined with what people know about her or why they even followed her in the first place, and the value that they'd want to get from her. And then one quick other note is you can start to set goals and stuff like this. There's many different things that you can do to optimize this further, but I would say that in general, again, it's really rare that someone gets a lot of money from something like Patreon, unless they invest a lot of time into it. And in the spectrum of things that you can focus on, I think, at least the way I view donations, it's kind of like it's a no-brainer to put it where you can put it, but I wouldn't invest in this area because there are other areas that are much more lucrative, especially over time. But I would say the reason it's a no-brainer is because it can really help you connect with your audience. I often say that things like buy me a coffee are actually better for the person donating than the one receiving, because it allows them to support the people that they want to support. I certainly feel that way when I support others online. So that's just something to note. Donations, no-brainer to start with. I wouldn't invest in it too much. Now, affiliates are also one that's a little bit of a no-brainer to start. It's pretty easy to start. And you can actually see some of the brands that I've mentioned throughout this course. NerdWallet, Consumer Reports, Wirecutter, these are all pretty big content sites that make a lot of money off of affiliates. So affiliates can actually get pretty big, but it also requires a lot of work to get super big. Wirecutter sold to the New York Times for I think 30 million. So you can see that you can, get to a sizable amount, but that requires a lot of work. So in the book, I talk about different types of affiliates. So the first one is self-serve. The second one is hidden. Self-serve is pretty straightforward. It just means that you can go in pretty much. There may be some vetting, but for the most part, you can go to someone's site. You can access their affiliate program. You can grab a link from that program and you can put it on your site somewhere. So you can start with marketplaces. Those are the easiest. Those are almost always completely open. You just go onto Amazon, for example, start an affiliate account, and then, any product on Amazon you can start advertising for. Of course, you should only advertise or use affiliate links for stuff that you actually respect or care about. But the idea here is that marketplaces are super easy to start engaging with, but by that nature, again, because more people engage with it, they tend to have lower commission fees. So there used to be blogs that would just make money through Amazon affiliates, but because they've consistently docked their affiliate commissions, it's really hard to do that now. Now, some other programs that you can do is you can look for individual companies that aren't necessarily on ShareASale or Amazon affiliates, but they have their own affiliate program. And this is a way that many of these companies grow. So they love having new affiliates or referrals. So you just go to these sites, Shopify, Webflow, etc. You go find their affiliate program. Because they are run by the individual company, and effectively, just like any referral program or affiliate program, you're helping them scale, they tend to pay out much more healthily than these marketplaces. And they tend to be, instead of 1% of the sales that you drive for Amazon, tends to be a flat rate. So for example, some of them with Shopify, it's like, I'll pay you, I think for Shopify, it's like $250 for a certain type of lead, right? Some of them do, for example, ClickFunnels, I think it's a percentage of the recurring revenue, but you get the point. They pay more if you can actually bring people in for their specific type of product. Now, there's one final self-serve, which is pretty similar to the individual companies' affiliate programs, but I say they're different because they're referral programs, and by that nature, they tend to be bi-directional, which means typically there's kind of like a give 100, get 100, for example, type model, and they tend to be credit-based, and this is something you should know. It's pretty obvious, but it is important that if you were to go and drive for example, like if 50 people to sign up for Robinhood or Questrade or Dropbox, what they give you back tends to be credits for their particular program. And in some cases, if it's TransferWise, that's basically cash. But if it's something like DigitalOcean, that's actually one that I've been a referral for. Basically, I have a bunch of DigitalOcean credits, which I think I've made like $2,000 in DigitalOcean credits, but my Droplet costs $5 a month, right? And you can't transfer these credits and stuff like that. So you just want to make sure that if you're doing these kind of bi-directional referral programs, that you actually want what you get back. So you're not investing in building up like $100,000 worth of server credits that you would never use. All right. Hidden, I want to quickly touch on, which is just basically anything else, anything that you don't find easily online. There's probably a referral program, or at least you can ask them to create one. And that sounds like a lot of work, but remember, these referral or affiliate programs are helping these companies scale. And so if they can actually get people to do the work for them, to scale their company, to sell their products for them, it's a no-brainer. So for example, on Gumroad, you can reach out to, if you took a course on Gumroad or you bought a product on Gumroad, you can probably become an affiliate for that particular product. You just need to reach out to the seller. That's what I did in allowing people to be affiliates for this product. Ghost, for example, is a product which I use, but they don't have an open affiliate program. So you just reach out to the products that you use, that you love, that you already engage with, and that you probably are already recommending to people, and then just reach out to them. And if they don't have an active affiliate or referral program, you can tell them that they can use more kind of like no-code referral programs like Rewardful. So TLDR here for affiliates, they can grow to a pretty significant size, but it would take a very long time to get anywhere close to the size of something like NerdWallet or Wirecutter. But especially for products that you're already using, that you already love, it's kind of, again, a no-brainer to integrate those affiliate links into your site. Obviously do so mindfully, but that's kind of my point of view on affiliates. Okay, the third easy one, or relatively easy one, is web ads. So web ads are exactly what you know them to be. They're those display ads that show up all over different sites, or at least some sites. They come through AdSense, Taboola, Outbrain, Mediavine, AdThrive. There are more, but those are the main ones. And the idea of web ads is that, or all you need to know about web ads is basically that super, super easy to implement. Like if you want to implement AdSense, it's all about just basically adding a script to your site, but super low CPMs. They don't pay much at all because they don't convert well for the end user. And you kind of get a sense of the scale that you would require. So 10,000 page views, you probably get around $30 or so for those page views. And that's not a laughable number of page views. So you can kind of get a sense of, if you wanted to really get thousands of dollars each month for implementing web ads, for example, you'd really need like 1 million page views, which is a lot, right? Like I'm nowhere near that. And so that's something to keep in mind. And the other thing to keep in mind here is that there are trade-offs, especially with web ads relative to the other things that I mentioned. So if you add a little button that says, hey, if you love my stuff, donate, that doesn't look so bad to the end user. Or if you say, have a link, which happens to be affiliate link, again, it doesn't look so bad to the user. But if you have a big, broad web ad on your site, or multiple on your site, those tend to look pretty low quality. They downgrade the reading. They also downgrade the loading experience, which is really important for SEO, as we talked about last week, to the point where not all of these, but for example, if you were to add some of these scripts to your site, it can increase loading time for anywhere up to like a couple seconds, which is non-trivial. In addition to that, you may be trading your relationship away to some degree with your audience, both in terms of their attention, right? Because you're literally distracting them with other things on your site, but also potentially in loading those scripts, you are sending a lot more data than I think most people realize about your readers back to these advertisers. And therefore you are in some way, shape, or form potentially trading away some of their privacy. And then finally, just by nature of, again, you're literally distracting them and creating a worse reading experience for them. So you may have fewer conversions. Now, I have seen some sites, this is from Farnham Street, that have managed to basically set up their own web ad system where they're only working with advertisers that they already, have approved, that they love, that they're proud of. And because they're setting up their own tech, it probably loads faster and all these things instead of installing some, massive script to your site. And so for that reason, I've seen some sites do it. And because they manage that relationship, they probably also charge their advertisers more. But the idea here is that in general, of all the things that we'll go through today, this is the one avenue where I would say, unless you have a huge amount of traffic somehow, you probably won't make much from web ads, and you probably would benefit from not adding them and actually investing in other areas. All right, so the next one though is advertising, but it's in a different form. It's through newsletter sponsorships. And this is an area where you can actually have a smaller audience and have it be lucrative. And the reason for that is you can charge more, because effectively your newsletter has already acted as a filter. So people going to your site, maybe they just happen to look up a particular keyword, or maybe they saw someone tweet about something. They go to your site and they're not sure. They haven't really interacted with you before. They see some ads. They're probably not going to click on them. But when they convert to your newsletter, or for the people that do, you basically filter them, and those people have higher intent. They want to listen, or they want to hear from you. They're more likely to listen to what you have to promote. And for that reason, newsletter sponsorships can be more lucrative, much more lucrative than something like a web ad. But this heavily depends, for the reasons that I just mentioned, on how engaged these people are, and also the potential or perceived value of the individuals that you have subscribed to your newsletter. And so this is really important, that in the way you price newsletter sponsorships, you want to think about the potential value that you can drive. So when you're thinking about potential sponsors and how much you should charge, you should really be asking the question, can I drive leads for them profitably? Or compared to the other places where they can be putting their money, how ROI positive is this for them or not? If they, for example, if you create a tool, or if you're advertising a tool, actually, in this case, can that tool save their employees 1% of their time? Because if it can, it's likely that they'd actually spend a lot on that. Or for example, if you can drive $1,000 worth of value for a company, why not charge $800? So again, I think this is a general kind of pricing approach or way to think about pricing, but people tend to price things based on, vague benchmarks, or just, I have this many subscribers on my list, so I think I can charge X. But depending on the engagement of those subscribers, and also how valuable those subscribers are. So a Fortune 500 exec is probably more valuable than a college student, for example. That's what you should be basing what you charge on, not necessarily, you should be basing your pricing on the value that you can drive, not necessarily these vague benchmarks. Because that's exactly how these companies are determining whether they want to sponsor your newsletter or not. So just as a quick example, there's a B2B company. That B2B company knows that for every contract that they sign, they can make $30,000. They know that 0.3% of people who, just express interest, who just say, hey, maybe I would sign up for a contract, 0.3% of them actually convert to a contract. And let's say they pay their marketing team an average of $100,000 a year. Well, with those things in mind, you can actually bake out that for every $90 that they spend, they actually, only need one lead. Therefore, if they spend $200 on an ad and it brings them 5 leads, that's super ROI positive for them. Similarly, if they can have a tool or a product that actually makes them 1% more effective, or even just one person on their team more effective, that's worth $1,000 to them. So newsletter sponsorships are more difficult because you do have to kind of manage the pipeline of inbound, outbound, things like that. We'll talk about those in a second. But if you have an engaged audience, it can be a lot more lucrative than something like a web ad, and it's scalable. All right, so if you're pricing newsletters, here are a couple additional things to know. So the pricing is always based on some sort of performance metric, and in general for newsletters, it tends to be clicks, impressions, or sends. And impressions are basically the same thing as opens in this case, because within a newsletter, you can't necessarily see if someone is scanning and seeing a particular part of that newsletter. You can only guarantee that they opened the newsletter. And so for that reason, again, newsletters tend to, if they're working on impressions, they use CPO, cost per open, instead of CPM. All right. The thing that you should take away from this slide, though, is actually the difference between CPC, CPO, and CPS, and why different newsletters use one or the other. So the best for the advertiser is always CPC. Why? Because what does an advertiser actually want? They want you to click to their site and engage with their potential product, right? Or potentially buy or sign up for their newsletter, whatever they want, whatever action they want you to take on their site requires you to actually get to their site. Okay, if that's true, what's the closest indicator for someone to get to the site? It's a click, right? And so if they can actually pay per click, where someone is actually taking action to go to their site, that's the most actionable thing for them, or the closest thing to providing value to them. Well, the reason this doesn't always work well for newsletters is not because it's not trackable. Clicks are super trackable, but because it's really hard to price this effectively, because a click to, for example, a B2B enterprise tool is actually should actually be way more expensive per click than, for example, something like a D2C clothing store, right? Because each lead to that company is worth more. It's the same reason that Google AdWords charges way more for a click on a term with the word mortgage in it versus like makeup. So great for an advertiser to charge CPC, but most newsletters don't do this because, again, so every company that sponsors you can be different. And it's really hard to decide what to charge for CPC. Now, if we go to the right, CPO is what I find the most common amongst big newsletters. And so CPO is still good for the advertiser because it's still guaranteeing people are opening this newsletter. They're at least going to see the ad, right? And it does put a little more onus on the newsletter to say, hey, I'm actually going to get someone to open it, right? So there needs to be engagement there. But at least for smaller newsletters, what they tend to do is CPS, which is cost per send. And the reason for that is because it's hard to necessarily guarantee a CPO, and there's a lot more calculations there, and billing gets complicated, for example, if you're doing CPO. But when you're small, you don't have time or the resources to do that. So CPS is basically like, look, I have X many subscribers. I'm just going to charge, $500 per send, for example. So this is easiest for the newsletter, but furthest away from providing value to the advertiser. And so if you're on the flip side and you're an advertiser, you just want to make sure that if you're doing, you're buying sends that are CPS, that you actually make sure that that audience is actually engaged. All right, so if you're unsure where to start, the things that I said on the previous slide still ring true, where if you do know, for example, a certain company, how much they pay for potential leads, how much value you can drive for them, start there. But if you truly have no idea where to start, you can start with certain benchmarks where, for example, one benchmark that I've heard is 5 cents per subscriber. So for example, if you have 1,000 subscribers, that's $50 to start. And then as you start to test that, you can basically use the data that you get in terms of if your slots fill up right away and people are renewing their ad slots, that probably means that you can raise the price. If the opposite is true, it probably means you should decrease the price. You can also look at marketplaces, so thought leaders and buy sell ads. There's also many more that I included in the book resources. And you can go to these and you can basically find a newsletter that is similar to you, both in terms of scope, so similar audience, and scale, right? And then you can, on certain marketplaces like this, you can actually just see how much they charge. But if there's a newsletter where you're unsure how much they charge and you don't find it on a marketplace, you can just reach out to them and say, hey, I'm interested in ad slot. Some people think this is sleazy, but they're going to tell any potential advertiser what they're charging. And you're just using this as data to figure out what you should charge. And so some other quick notes here are, you can also consider multiple slots. If you're feeling a little antsy about charging too much, you could, for example, have 3 slots where, let's say you have 5,000 subscribers. If you're like, I don't really feel comfortable spending or charging $250, you have 3 slots, $150 for the top one, $75 for the bottom 2. That's actually worth more than $250 in total. The downside to that, which is worth noting, is that it's going to take more work for you to fill up these ad slots. And that's something actually I really want to call out here, is that something that I found last year when I was selling sponsorships, it can be super distracting. Our job, hopefully as content creators, is to go and provide value to people through our content, not to become an ad salesman. And so in general, what I tend to do, or what I think is beneficial, is to actually just lowball your prices a little bit. Don't completely cheap out. You should, price yourself accordingly. But in lowballing a little bit, you can actually just get a bunch of advertisers in, fill up all your slots, and not worry about consistently trying to fill these slots. And then finally, you can also remember that your newsletter, for example, is not the only place that you can start to charge. So for example, if someone sponsors your newsletter, you can actually charge more by promising them, that you'll post on social. Maybe you could do a webinar with them. You can have different bundles, and you can be creative here where it doesn't have to be so cut and dry. Chris is asking, is 5 cents based on CPS? Yes. So again, in this case, if you're a small newsletter, these benchmarks are mostly for small newsletters. As you get bigger, things like The Hustle or Morning Brew, they tend to do the CPO because, again, it's more lucrative or better for the advertiser. But when you're earlier on, if you're doing CPO, think about the billing nature of that, if you're doing CPO, you have to check your opens, right, for every send that you do. And then you need to bill the advertiser and say, hey, I had this many opens and we agreed on X dollar per 1,000 opens. So here's your bill, right? But the CPS gives you the opportunity to say, hey, I'm charging 5 cents per subscriber. That's just like a vague idea. That's again, a vague benchmark that you can start with. You would never actually say to the advertiser, I'm charging 5 cents a subscriber. You would just say, I charge $50 per send. So yeah, that 5 cents is based on CPS. And then a second question is rough idea on size to achieve milestone switching to CPO. Well, so there's no necessary milestone. It's more so like, do you have the bandwidth? And I wouldn't do it until you get quite big, because again, it's more of a logistics thing, right? If there was like some really easy tool to run this, maybe, but think about the logistics. If you're doing CPS, is basically, hey, and I'll talk about the promote page in a second. It might actually be the next, oh no, it's not the next slide, but you can actually say, I'll just jump to the promote page just because I'm talking about this. You can actually put up a page and say, hey, I charge $50 or I charge $100 or whatever. People can pay you on the spot. You have that locked in, and that is the transaction complete, right? They've paid for something, and then they will get the value when the ad is run. If you do CPO, the way that billing works is that you say my CPO is like, let's say, and CPO is cost per 1,000 impressions, just like CPM is cost per 1,000 opens and cost per 1,000 impressions. And so in this case, if you did CPO, you would basically say, hey, we agreed on this thing. You would sign some contract and says, yes, we will pay, I think, for example, anywhere between like $20 to $50 cost per 1,000 opens. And then you would settle on a price, then you would run the ad. And then when the ad is done, you go back to the advertiser and say, hey, look, this is my report. I got this many opens. Therefore, we're charging you exactly this. And so it just adds so much more organizational headache. And if you don't have a team, this is really kind of at the point that you would, I think, start to consider doing CPO is when you actually start to consider having more of an ad sales team. And so if you're not at that point, I wouldn't go to CPO, at least at the beginning. All right, so if you are getting sponsors, sorry, I'm flipping around here. Yes, if you are at the point where you're like, okay, I want to get sponsors, just a couple quick tips here. You can start by, if you're like truly unsure where to find the right sponsors for you, just start with newsletters in your niche, similar again in size and scope, and subscribe to those newsletters, find out who's advertising in those, and then just reach out to them and see if they want to advertise yours. This is the best way to do it if you're doing outbound, because there are only certain companies that are willing to advertise in newsletters. So some of them are too small, they don't have the budget. Some of them are too big, they have certain acquisition channels that are running for them, and newsletter sponsorships are honestly just a headache. I used to work at a company like this where we had the budget. It just didn't make sense logistically for us. And it means that there are also only certain types of services and products that do well advertising in newsletters. And if you see some company that is advertising in a newsletter, especially if you see them repeatedly advertising that newsletter, it probably means it's ROI positive for them, and therefore they're more likely to want to engage with you. So that's the easiest way to get started if you're looking for sponsors. You can also do inbound, in which case you just add a note in your own newsletter that says, hey, I'm opening up sponsorships, or under your sponsor, you can just say, hey, if you'd like to sponsor, click here or whatever. If you do outbound though, quick suggestions as someone who's worked on both sides of this equation, reduce the decision points. So don't reach out to someone on, for example, their operations team. They're not going to decide. Reach out to someone on their marketing team. And if possible, reach out to someone on their marketing team who's high enough to make that decision on the spot. Be transparent with stats. So again, you want to make it as easy for them to be like, yeah, sounds great, let's do this. So include your open rate, include your click-through rate, include other sponsors that have worked with you. So add social proof. The most convincing thing is saying, for example, if you're taking two competitors like The Hustle and Morning Brew, if you're trying to convince The Hustle to sponsor something, just say that Morning Brew did, or vice versa, right? Those are just two examples, but the idea is that companies are much more likely to engage if they know that their competitors are also already engaging there. All right, so I talked a little bit about this promote page, but the idea here is that if you are doing outbound or if you are doing inbound, this is valuable to you because, so Andrew Camphy is a friend of mine, and he basically, I'm not sure exactly where he got the stat from, but he says 150 minutes are spent on average going back and forth between potential advertisers or sponsors. And from my own experience, this is true. And so what you can do is create a page that makes it as easy for you and the potential sponsor to engage, in which case it says exactly what you charge. This is, again, easier if you do CPS, right? But basically it says exactly what you charge, and it allows them to go and purchase right away. And I take the link to my promote page, and I don't do it as much anymore, but at the time when I created it, I would link it at the bottom of my articles, and I would get people to sponsor my newsletter overnight, right? I'd be sleeping and I'd wake up and there would be, at the time I was charging $50, and there'd be someone who paid $50 for the next sentence, for example. And so it makes it really easy for you to avoid this like back and forth where people are unsure and you have to send them billing links and all this stuff, where you just say, hey, all in, here's everything you need to know. And if you're interested, just click and move forward. You can see dense discovery also includes things like kind of like the demographics of their readership. Nomad List has a bunch of stuff here as well. So anyway, the idea here is promote page will save you time and save them time, and you can get kind of like these passive sponsorships, so you don't have to do as much outreach yourself. All right, so that's it for newsletters. I think this is the final one, which is just products. So far, for the most part, with the exception of content, paid content, you are selling the attention of your audience, right? So you have all these people who trust you, who are listening to you because they respect you for some reason or another, and then you're selling their attention, which is okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, most companies advertise, and everyone has bought something from an advertisement, so there's nothing wrong with it. But it's worth noting that that is the transaction that is going on. And so something to keep in mind is that a lot of the time we defer to things like affiliates or newsletter sponsorships or web ads because they're way easier, right? Again, as I said, it's easier to stick a pixel on your site than to go and create your own product. It's easier to sell one thing to one brand, which is a sponsorship, than to sell a bunch of things yourself and figure out all those logistics, create the product, etc. So that's kind of like the first thing that you should know. But the second thing that you should know, which is almost like the flip side of that coin, is I'm not necessarily saying that you should go and create products for everything, because that's always the right move. And the example I like to give is an airport. So an airport has basically this concentrated attention engine, right, of people when they're in the airport for like the 2 or 3 hours that they're there. Now, if the airport wanted to completely milk out all the potential value that they could, they would go and create a private label brand for every product in that airport, whether it's magazines, whether it's water bottles, food, etc. Well, maybe they will do that one day, but in reality, running an airport is hard enough on its own, right? So they're happy to rent out that space to other vendors so that they can make money, and the airport can focus on running the airport. So keep that in mind, where you don't want creating new products to be too distracting to where you can't actually run your existing engine, right? So with both of those two things in mind, the thing that you can ask yourself is basically, what do I know through the interactions that I've had with my audience, through the things that I filter them by? What do they need? And does this overlap with something that I'm able to create relatively easily? It doesn't necessarily need to be easy, but something that I know I can create and won't be too much of a distraction or outside of my own capabilities. So the summary for products is that they're hardest to create of the things that we've gone through so far, but they also can have the biggest payoff if it doesn't distract you too much and you know what your audience truly wants. So a couple examples, these probably will be super familiar, but information products. This book is an information product. There's tons of others like Nat Rome Course, David Perell's Rite of Passage, Calvin. I've talked about his book summaries at points throughout this presentation or these presentations, and he went and created basically like a book summary library. So there's different types of information products, but with all three of these examples, it was something that these people were relatively known for, right? So David Perell's really known for his writing, and they created a back-end product for something that their audience cared about. Community and memberships, I want to call this one out because they're often paired with information. I actually think a lot of people go wrong when they try to sell a community on their own. And the Hustle, for example, the Trends product that I run, that is an information product and a community. And the reason I say that they're often paired and that they should be paired to some degree is because it's really hard to sell a community on its own. So this idea of perceived value that I've talked about throughout these presentations, which is really important, that there are certain things that people are willing to pay for and certain things that people don't know how to put a monetary value on. Community is one of those things where if you were to ask someone, how much would you be willing to pay to be in this community? It'd be really hard for them to put a monetary value on it because it's hard to really understand the value that it's providing. And so for that reason, you generally can bring people in to a community-oriented product through information. And another benefit of that is as you're doing that, as you're bringing them in through information, you're filtering them so you have the right people in the community. They're self-selecting who care about, for example, the Hustles group. They're self-selecting that they care about entrepreneurship, or they're entrepreneurs themselves, they're operators, and they are self-selecting based on the information that they want to read, and therefore the community thrives because you have the right people filtered into there. And so most community products are joint with information. It's really, really hard to start a community from scratch as just a community. Quickly through some of the others, software. Many companies start as a software company and then they layer on content or publication on top of that. CB Insights is a great example for that, but you can also do things like create your own tooling, right? So create things like Lightroom presets or a job board for your audience. Something to note here is that a job board, the biggest misunderstanding with job boards is that they are really, really easy to create, but the hard part is actually driving enough traffic to them so that they're valuable, right? So anyone can create a job board these days with the no-code tools that exist out there, but remember that it's hard to actually make sure that you have a big enough audience that cares about using that job board because there's so many job boards out there. Services, basically, depending on what you're writing about, if people are listening to you, they trust you, they probably potentially want your one-on-one expertise, and you can create some sort of agency. So Nat Eliason started an SEO agency, Growth Machine. Julian Shapiro created one called Demand Curve. So those are great examples of where you kind of productize yourself or the things that you know best into a service. And then physical products, pretty straightforward. Just because you do stuff online does not mean that you cannot sell physical products. So anything from launching things on a Kickstarter, like the Unnecessary Inventions guy, he started like a jigsaw puzzle table that honestly I want to buy. Clothing lines, things like that. Redbubble is a great 3PL tool, which basically helps you if you wanted to create merch. It helps you you just upload the design and you don't have to do any of that logistics stuff. Tons of examples, endless examples of physical products. Again, just make sure that it's aligned with what your audience would actually want. And then I want to just quickly note acquisition. This wasn't actually in the book, but I think in general, especially with newsletters, there's a big boom right now where people care about them. Some of them are actually starting to get acquired. Double-Sided was acquired. There's word that Morning Brew may be acquired, still up in the air. But the idea that I want to articulate here is that it's much easier to sell a content engine, right? Like Wirecutter, if it's non-personal. So it would be very hard, if not impossible, for me to sell StephSmith.io because I am Steph Smith. I don't know how that brand would continue without me actually as part of that. Versus if you run something like Morning Brew or Wirecutter, there is no personal association with that, or very little, and therefore it's much easier to sell, and likely if you are going to sell at higher multiples. So just something to consider if acquisition matters to you. In my case, it's not something that I'm targeting, and so that doesn't matter, but just something to consider. And then finally, I believe this is the last slide before summary, but basically something I want to call out that I've mentioned already, but is so important, is perceived value. With all the products that you potentially create, it's so much harder to change the opinion of people in terms of what they think something is worth than to actually just create things within the realm of what they actually, within the perceived value matrix that they already believe. So a great example of this is, if you've ever heard of Seth Godin's Alt MBA, this is effectively a course, right? And actually most of the material in here could actually even be put together in an ebook, right? And in his case, he wanted to charge, so they charge for the Alt MBA, I don't know if you guys can see this, $4,450. That's a lot of money, right? And if he was to call this an ebook, take all the same information, put it into an ebook, he could not charge more than probably $100 for it. Now, even if he called it just a general course, because of people's impression of courses, he probably wouldn't be able to charge more than anywhere from a couple $100s to maybe super low thousands, right? But because he actually used this idea of perceived value to compare it to something that has a huge perceived value, which is an MBA, right? An MBA costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, then he was actually able to use this perceived value to his advantage, right? And so just remember that no matter how valuable you think what you're creating is, it's always going to be compared to what already exists out there at the time, right? And so the same thing is true with my ebook. I went with the ebook because that's the medium that I wanted to disseminate this information with. But I also was very aware that, you know, with this given the ebook market out there, I'm not going to be able to charge thousands of dollars for this, no matter how good it is. And I was okay with that, but it's something to consider. You can also, if your product aligns with this, you can remind people that they can gift and expense it. So people are much more likely to want to spend more if they're gifting something to someone, or certainly if they can expense it with their company. And so all that takes is a quick reminder that, hey, you can expense this, or you can gift it, and people are more likely to actually purchase it in that case. And then finally, this is a tactic that I used with my product: let the market decide, which basically means you don't need to do this, but if you're unsure what you should price something at, humans are horrible at pricing because, again, we focus too much on what we think something is worth based on the amount of time we've invested versus the net value it drives for the person who bought it. In which case, if you let the market decide by basically changing the price, allowing it to fluctuate until you get to a good conversion rate, if you can do that, then you're actually letting the market give you data, real data about what people think this should be priced at. So that's what I did with my ebook. Started at $10, went at $5 all the way to 30. It actually went to 35. And then this is during the pre-sale, by the way. And then at 35 during the pre-sale, I saw it wavering, conversion rate dropped significantly. And so then I just left it at $30. I can see. Yeah, so Chris made a good point. You can frame a product as an investment rather than expense. The reason I use the word expense here is because people always, you know, if they're like, oh, I can expense this, that basically means my company's paying, not me. So yeah, you can also frame it as an investment in yourself, certainly if it's any sort of educational product. But the idea of expensing it is specifically so that I had a couple people DM me. I didn't use this tactic on this book, but say, hey, like I ended up, you know, like my company bought it or whatever, in which case they're much more likely to purchase it if they know that they can expense it with the company. But of course, only certain products fall within that kind of range of things that you can expense. So that's worth keeping in mind. So quick summary, and if you guys have any questions, feel free to add them to the chat. But the idea here is that, again, it's like distribution. There's no correct way to monetize your stuff. There are many ways, and there are other ways that are not even on here. But the idea here is to think about what fits with what you need to do, what you want to do, what you can do, right? How quickly do you need to monetize? If you can kind of lay low and just build up your audience without charging right away, that can kind of give you this unfettered freedom to build up your audience and not have to extract value right away. And so in general, anything, again, that's easy. So affiliates, web ads, donations, anything that's super easy is pretty competitive, and likely you need a large audience for it to start paying off pretty lucratively. But as you move your way up, the harder that thing is, the less likely that people are participating. But of course, the more effort that it takes. So that's kind of how you might think about it. And in general, you want to just, across all of these dimensions, remember at the beginning, remember your contract and make sure that you're delivering value, or if you're creating things that people actually want, especially if you're creating products and services. So yeah, that's it for this session. Like I said, it's shorter than some of the others. But yeah, if you guys have any questions, whether it's about channels or, you know, maybe you guys are monetizing something and you're thinking about pricing or anything like that. I know, Chris, you've had a couple already, but yeah, if not, I'm happy to give you guys your time back. It's Friday night for me. It might be Saturday morning for some of you. So I'll wait a couple seconds, but if not, I will give you your time back. And I did get a question from Karina on information products. Why did you choose to write an ebook versus doing a course? Are you considering creating additional information products or any other formats that you might recommend? So good question. So this whole book was a little bit of an accident, is perhaps not the right term for it, but I was not sure that I didn't even know I was creating a book. And for me, this was the easiest way for me to basically do what I call brain dump, which is I've done all these years or spent all these years in content and marketing. And I just wanted to like dump all that information into something legible that people could access and could benefit them. So the idea of this was not, or the intention of this was not to go make a bunch of money. It was really just like, how do I kind of take this information and make it valuable for other people? So I started with the book. It was only supposed to be a short book, ended up being a much longer book. I added these sessions in with the intention of not necessarily changing the price or anything like that, but just so that it was more likely that people would get value out of this book. Now, since it's gone way better than I expected, I've had many people ask, are you going to go create a course? Are you going to go create some paid newsletter? I've decided definitely I'm not going to go create the paid newsletter. I may create some sort of course in the future, but in the short term, that is not a priority of mine. I think really if I focus on just what I was trying to achieve here, which was not maximizing money, but just how do I create an asset that people can use that will make them understand how to do content right and hopefully get value from it. I've done that. And because it's an online resource, literally anyone in the world can go get access to it now. And so that's what I'm happy with. Like, I feel content with that. Again, maybe in the future I'll do a course, but I think being honest with myself, I probably will not. What I am excited about is that I'm constantly, like, even before this book, I'm always building stuff. And so I have a bunch of ideas of stuff that I want to build outside of this book, which are completely unrelated to this book. But in general, I don't think I'll do much else with this, with the exception that I had one company reach out to me to see if they wanted to partner on an audio version of it. I may create some sort of just purely audio version of it, because I think that just might be a fun experience. But that's really the sentiment of how I'm deciding on this, is just like, would I enjoy this? Like, do I think it would provide value to people? And honestly, I think anyone who wants to learn the content in this book can just buy the book and watch these recorded live sessions, and they'll get the most out of that. I don't necessarily need to create some sort of course for it. Kartik is asking, how do you keep all of these resources organized? Any tips? And in general, how do you manage your side projects and full-time job? When you say resources, do you mean just like for this book in particular?
Yeah. So in general, right? There are so many resources out there. I keep,
Right.
I keep putting them at some places, but it's always difficult.
Yeah. So I
Stay
use,
on top of it.
yeah, I mean, everyone uses different information management tools. I use Evernote, so I'm in that space, kind of like a grandmother, I guess. But in the sense that, like, everyone talks about Notion and Rome, I just use Evernote, and I try to take note of just like anything that I find interesting and or any tools that I find useful. And I think probably just similar to everyone else, if anything, I take too many notes because then they get lost, and
Yes.
it's hard to digest them and stuff like that. And so I'll kind of routinely go through my notes, and with any given like note section, just like decide. So for example, I did this presentation about COVID for The Hustle in March or something, or maybe more like May, actually, probably. But I did that. And then after that presentation, I'm like, wow, I probably want to do version 2 of this. And I just started taking so many notes on COVID and the economy and all this stuff. And then I revisited it after doing that for like a month. And even though there was so much in that document, I was like, this is really not going to be useful for me or for anyone. And I just decided to trash it. I think something that we do with our digital workspaces is we don't often delete things, like, because we can save them, right? But I think it's good to do like just a complete wipe of certain things, and just to continuously check, like, should I still be tracking these types of tools, or should I still be tracking notes on like COVID and the economy? Maybe, but in that particular case for me, it was like, no, I should get rid of this. So I think it's good to do almost like a information cleanse every month or every 2 months, because if not, things can get pretty gnarly, right? Where you're just like overwhelmed and then you don't do anything with it, right? So for this, in the particular case of this book and the resources, I had an ongoing note in my Evernote from the last year or so of just tools or things that I ran into, tactics for like online content overall. But I will say that I'm one of the least organized people that I know. A lot of people think because I do a lot online that I'm an organized person. At least from a traditional standpoint, I'm not organized. So it took me like days just to go through that note and kind of pick out parts of it. But I think everyone has their own kind of type of process that works for them. And for me, it's just kind of dumping things into Evernote and cleansing it every so often to make sure that I'm not wasting my time taking notes on particular things. And your second question was, how do you manage your side projects and full-time job? I mean, I think I'm lucky I work for a company that allows me to do that. I think that's a big limitation for many people. B, I've worked a lot over the last couple of years on just figuring out how to maximize my time. So I'm not perfect. Like I watch some TV, I, do some things that like are distracting and probably not good. But in general, I spend most of my time creating stuff, right? Outside of like my hobbies and hanging out with friends. Like I don't have that much filler time because I'm so excited about the things that I want to create that I end up filling most of that time with creating stuff. And some people are like, oh, you totally overwork yourself. But I've made a very clear delineation of like, I have my job, and I've written about this where my job is my job. It's my financial security. I enjoy that as well. But because of that, I can actually be so much more creative on the side where as you guys saw, for many years, I wasn't making any money. And for that reason, I'm happy to spend, parts of my weekends, if not full weekends, parts of my nights working on these projects, which I think if you happen to be working a full-time job and then trying to work on side projects that you don't actually love, that's when it can get super exhausting and not worth it. But I know I don't have like a perfect answer there, but in general, I just spent a lot of my time creating. And I also am lucky to have like a pretty flexible company that kind of supports me in that. Chris is asking, are you still writing for Trends/The Hustle? If so, I may have an article idea for you about investing in cannabis. Yeah, please email me. I don't actively write anymore just because we've hired some great writers now, and I lead the product. So I focus on actually scaling the product, getting in more subscribers, things like that. And in general, just making the product better and working with our tech team and stuff like that. So I don't write, but please email me. You can email me at steph@thehustle.co. And yeah, we're always looking for ideas if people have them about trends that are up and coming. So yeah, feel free to do that, Chris. Any other questions, or if I didn't answer or touch on your questions fully, happy to answer any follow-up questions. If not, I will just quickly mention that, thank you so much for attending another session. As I said, this will be the last kind of lecture style session. I haven't 100% figured out what I want to do for the next session, but it will be more interactive. There will not be slides. It'll be more so connecting people in this community and figuring out how people can get value from this moving forward, because that will be the final live session. And then in general, if there's any outstanding questions, please feel free to come with them next week. But yeah, thanks, Chris. Hope you have a great weekend, and thanks everyone for joining. I will stop sharing, and yeah, I hope to see you all next week. Bye.